Horace Mann once said, "Education, then, beyond all other devices of human origin, is a great equalizer of the conditions of men, the balance wheel of the social machinery." The 1830s education reform was a turning point in U.S. history because it gave children access to a better education. By the time of the Civil War, in 1861, organized systems of common schools became normal throughout most northern and midwestern states. Reformers such as Horace Mann, Henry Bernard, James G. Carter, Catherine Beecher, and many others began to argue successfully for a greater government role in the schooling of all children. At the beginning of the 1800s, the United States was overwhelmingly a rural nation. Only 5% of its population lived in cities. School was not mandatory to attend, and what little time children had was often cut short by harvest season. Rural schools were often in session half as many days as schools in the cities. Then, from 1820 to 1840, the Industrial Development transformed a subsistence economy to a market economy. This allowed farmers to sell their crops for a profit. With money to spare, farmers began hiring workers instead of relying on the labor of their children, and, as rural capitalism developed, children had more time to spend in school. However, a good education was uncommon in rural areas. Schools were often poorly constructed rectangular buildings with cheap benches, little supplies, and no electricity or running water. Children did not have pens and paper, but instead chalk and a chalkboard. There were very few books, and the lessons were irregular, with no guideline or standards for the teacher to follow. The teachers were commonly between 17 to 24 years old, with no formal training. Only a few had higher than an elementary education themselves. Pay was low, and teachers frequently boarded round at the homes of their pupils' parents. Each week, a teacher would move into another student's house and be provided with room and board as part of their pay. However, rural schools weren't the only ones suffering from a shortage of pay, lack of attendance, and poor funding. Schools inside cities were equally impoverished and oftentimes met with completely different issues than rural schools. In the 1780s and 1790s, many urban children were taught in independent pay schools. These schools were diverse in character, and the schoolmaster commonly charged quarterly fees within the means of perhaps 3/4 of the population. These fees were often around $2 a quarter, which was a payment most day laborers, clerical workers, craftsmen, cartmen, mariners, and others weren't able to meet. Those children whose families could not afford a common pay school might have been able to receive some elementary education through an apprenticeship or a charity church school. In 1792, activist Sarah Trimmer said, "Children of the poor should not be educated in such manner as to set them above the occupations of humble life, or so as to make them uncomfortable among their equals." Church schools often provided food, clothes, and lodging to those in need. They sought to give an education to destitute children in the hopes of preventing ignorance, vice, and debauchery. The realization of the benefits of education was growing, and by 1810, Philadelphia alone had 12 charity schools, and by 1830, schooling was available to most white Americans in the North. However, in many communities, school sessions were still brief, faculties were cruel, and teachers were only a few steps ahead of their pupils. Seeing these issues in America's education system, leaders such as James G. Carter, Henry Bernard, and Horace Mann began working to give all children access to an accurate, uniform education. James Gordon Carter was one of the earlier reformers of the 19th century. Born in 1795, James had little expectations for farming New England soil and became determined to get into college. In 1813, Carter went away to Groton, now Lawrence Academy, and later finished his schooling well up in the Harvard class of 1820. During his time at Groton, he taught at troubled district schools and realized firsthand that, in his opinion, poor teachers and bad textbooks played the largest roles in the deficiency of public schools. Carter's greatest contribution to the education reform was numerous provocative articles, essays, and papers convincing the people on the importance of education. In 1821, James wrote a series of articles to the Boston Transcript, which launched his career as an educational propagandist. In 1824, he became editor of the United States Literary Gazette in Boston, an important source of educational reform. In 1824, Carter submitted a more authoritative series of articles to the Boston Patriot and Mercantile Advisor demanding reform. In 1826, a pamphlet with Carter's essays on reform was published in Boston, called the Essays Upon Popular Education, which was enthusiastically received by people and had an immediate effect in stimulating Massachusetts legislation. His writings influenced the 1827 law making the support of high schools by taxation compulsory and the requirement of teaching practical subjects such as English and history. In 1830, he joined with George Emerson, Colburn, and others in establishing the American Institute of Instruction. He was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives, where he sponsored one of the first American child labor laws, a pioneer effect in compulsory attendance for young workers. He was later elected to the state Senate also. Carter's reform propaganda and personal efforts were said to be one of the most powerful influences in establishing the Massachusetts Board of Education in 1837. From 1840 until his death, Carter participated actively as a member of the school committee, reporter, and speaker of charitable organizations. He influenced numerous bills, advocated teacher training, and built sentiment to bring a better education to all. Children. Henry Bernard, like James, was an American educationalist and reformer. Born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1811 to a wealthy family, Bernard graduated from Yale in 1830, then studied law. As a Whig member of the Connecticut State Legislature from 1837 to 1839, he was instrumental in legislation that created a state board of common schools. In 1838, he founded and edited the Connecticut Common School Journal and Annals of Education. Henry Bernard was passionately interested in improvements with the school system, particularly teacher training, and in 1838 Bernard told the state legislature that the day of school keeping has passed. It was idle to expect good schools until we have good teachers. He urged appropriate training in classes and seminaries established for that specific purpose. Henry Bernard, along with Horace Mann in 1839, established one of the first successful teacher training institutes, also known as normal schools, which still operates today as Framingham State University in Massachusetts. Bernard hosted some 1,100 public hearings on education and distributed 16,000 education pamphlets across the country, bringing awareness of a better education to rural and urban areas. In 1843, Bernard was called to Rhode Island to make a study of that state's schools, and in 1845 he became the state's first commissioner of education. At his urging, appropriations were increased and teachers' wages were raised, buildings repaired, teacher and training supervisions were improved, and in that same year, Bernard established the Rhode Island Teachers Institute of Instruction at Smithville Seminary. He returned to Connecticut in 1849 and established reforms similar to those in Rhode Island. He retired in 1855 and died on July 5, 1900. Undoubtedly the most well-known education reformer, Horace Mann promoted universal education and teacher training. Born into poverty in 1796, Mann was part of the common pattern of most rural schools and became mostly self-educated. In 1860, Mann attended half a year at Barrett School, then transferred to Brown University, graduating at the top of his class in 1819. In 1820, Mann championed intemperance and the treatment of criminal reforms, along with influencing temperance and religious toleration. He commissioned the Worcester State Hospital in 1829. In 1837, with James G. Carter, Mann helped create the Massachusetts Board of Education, with Mann assuming stewardship as its secretary. Accepting a 50% cut in his pay from $3,000 to $1,500, he recorded in his personal records, "I have faith in the improvability of the race and in their accelerating improvability." Conducting town meetings across the state, giving the speech, "The Means and Objects of Common School Education," arguing that all citizens, regardless of race or economic status, should have access to a tuition-free, tax-supported public school system. In 1838, he started a bi-weekly journal called the Common School Journal for teachers and lectured on education. Mann influenced the first of several normal schools established to train teachers in Lexington, Massachusetts in 1839. He worked to double teachers' salaries and advocated a property tax to pay for their higher wages and rebuild rural schools. In 1852, Mann accepted the position of president of the Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Over his years as an educational reformer, Mann saw revenue for education rise precipitously. He popularized the idea of a central bureaucracy to manage primary and secondary education and advised legislature on implementing equal programs throughout the state. During the early 1800s, public schools were few and far apart. Then, reformers such as James G. Carter, Henry Bernard, and Horace Mann turned the public school system around. Teachers' education and salaries were improved, funding was established, towns became required to provide a public education, women's, African Americans, disabled, and insane people's rights were improved, and both rural and urban schools were rebuilt. As a result, by 1870 there were approximately 125,000 public schools in the U.S., and by 1920 there was over 275,000. Those leading reformers inspired a change in the American education system, where today over 75% of our nation's kids are enrolled in